بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نرحب بالضيوف الكرام ونفتتح الجلسة الأولى. أولا في كلمة للأستاذة الدكتورة نورة فالكاو، مديرة المعهد الوقائي لإساءة استعمال المواد المخدرة، وتتفضل الدكتورة في إلقاء كلمتها، وبعد ذلك تفتتح الجلسة الأخرى برئاسة الدكتور جيلبرتو جيرا رئيس فرع الصحة والوقاية من المخدرات. فليتفضل. شكرا.
Good morning to everyone. Thank you for coming to this session. And really, let me say that I represent this morning the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime here. Yesterday we have had our executive director. We are very happy to cooperate to this symposium with the government of Saudi Arabia, particularly with the Ministry of Interior. And let me say that we started with the government of Saudi Arabia a real adventure in these last months to cooperate, to be partner in this work in improving prevention and treatment in these countries and in the region, and involving the government of Saudi Arabia in a partnership that will be useful, will be effective in changing the things for also low-income countries in the region. I'm very happy this morning to be here and to give the floor to the first speaker of the morning, that is Dr. Nora Volkov. Dr. Volkov is an exceptional presence for us. He's really the director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse, NIDA, National Institute of Drug Abuse in Bethesda, Washington, is doing or financing or supporting or coordinating most of the research in addiction medicine that is done on the face of the earth, particularly in the United States. Dr. Volkov is not only a manager, she's an outstanding scientist. She has a lot of publications. She started particularly to study the brain through the technique of brain imaging. And I have to say that for me, she's really a very important person, because she's a champion of what I consider a growing movement for establishing, for the recognition of drug addiction and addiction in general as disease. Not something moral, not something criminal, not something to be punished, but to be really prevented and treated such as any other disease. And Nora Volkov is really the first of us in promoting this kind of stop discrimination for drug users, treating them equally in the normal health system, and considering them people affected by a problem, by a suffering, and not people to be punished. So thank you, Dr. Volkov. You have the floor.
Gilberto, thanks very much. Good morning. It's basically an honor for me to be here. I want to thank the opportunity to be here in Saudi Arabia. This is my first trip ever. And I thank you for giving me the chance to come to you and discuss some of the findings that relate to the science of substance use disorders and addiction. Tremendous advances have been made over the past 20 years that have led us to recognize that drug addiction is a disease of the brain. It's a chronic disease, which means that the changes in the brain associated with taking drugs are long-lasting and persist years after the person's taking drugs. Many of the breakthroughs that have transformed the way that we look at addiction come from studies that use imaging technologies that allow us to directly look in the human brain and to interrogate what type of changes have happened in a person that takes drugs, just like we have been doing for other medical diseases. And this is elegantly illustrated in the slide that I'm showing you here, that uses a technology for imaging the consumption of sugar by the brain or other tissues. In the lower part, you see the image of a healthy heart, and you see a very high consumption of glucose, because the myocardium, the heart, its main function is to contract itself, for which it requires a massive amount of energy. The heart by the side is the image of a person that suffered a myocardial infarct, who was tested with the same methodology, except that now you see that in this area where you have an arrow, there is a dramatic reduction in the consumption of glucose. And this information is used by the surgeons to determine exactly which area of the myocardium needs to be repaired. The same methodology can now be applied to the human brain, and you can use it exactly to compare a human normal brain for the brain of an addicted person. The images that you are seeing here are horizontal cuts, anterior, posterior, left and right, and illustrated just as for the heart is the area of the brain where drug-addicted people have a decrease in consumption of glucose, which reflects that harmful effects of drugs on that particular area of the brain, which is not working properly. What is very telling is that this area of the brain, which is part of the frontal cortex, is crucial for our ability to make judgments and for our ability to exert self-control. So now we understand that one of the reasons why it is so very difficult for people that are addicted to stop taking drugs is because the area of the brain that allows us to exert self-control is not functioning. Out of multiple years of research in animal experiments particularly, we have come to realize why is it that certain drugs, the drugs that produce addiction, why do they do so? We now, it is very well understood that all of the drugs, whether it is legal, like tobacco, cigarette smoking, or illegal, like heroin, all of them have a common pharmacological effect in the brain, and that is they increase dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. And the nucleus accumbens is the main reward area of our brain. And the reward system evolved over millions of years of evolution to ensure, nature did that, to ensure that an organism will be doing the behaviors that are indispensable for survival of the individual, like eating, or for survival of the species, like reproduction. So these behaviors that are fundamental for survival are linked with the activation of this reward pathway in the nucleus accumbens. And this is mediated by signaling through dopamine, the chemical dopamine. You see here in an animal experiment that measures the increases in dopamine when an animal that has been food deprived is given food. Dopamine goes up, and the magnitude of the increase of dopamine actually predicts how much the animal will work in order to get the food. When you look at the effects of drugs, like for example amphetamine, you can see a much more dramatic increase in dopamine and much longer lasting. And that's exactly what drugs do. They emulate, but they do it in a much more effective way, the activation of the reward system that nature evolved for us to survive. And by doing this, it can actually ultimately disrupt the behaviors of the person to the point that normal behaviors indispensable for survival are given up for the consumption of the drug. The third thing that we now know very clearly is that drug addiction is a developmental disease. And what does that mean? It means that the process of addictions are initiated very early in life, usually in adolescence, and unfortunately, in some instances, in late childhood. So most of the diagnoses of dependence or addictions are going to be made when individuals are in their late teens or their early 20s. And this has to do with two very important factors. The brain of the adolescent, now we know, is actually very different from the brain of the adult. And there are many differences. But one of the most important as it relates to addiction behaviors is the fact that the adolescent brain is not fully connected. It will not fully connect until it reaches late 20s. And among the connections, the last connections to form are those between the frontal cortex and the limbic brain. And the limbic brain contains the areas of the brain that allow us to have emotions, like the amygdala, as well as the reward centers of the brain. So the connection of the frontal cortex with the limbic brain is actually what allows us to exert control, cognitive control, over our emotions and cognitive control over our desires. And this explains why an adolescent or a very young adult is much less able to contain their desires or their emotions than an adult, because the anatomical connection that allows him to do so is not fully formed. The implications of these differences are actually crucial when we think of prevention, because as we look at the problem of drugs in a general sense, the most important intervention that we can do is prevention of drug use. And you have to target children and adolescents. You cannot wait until it is too late, because the age of greater risk is during that transition, those transition years from late childhood into early adulthood. The fourth thing that is clear from scientific findings is that repeated use of drugs will physically change your brain. And it changes in multiple ways. Among others, it damages the function of frontal areas involved with self-control. But it also directly interferes with the function of the dopaminergic system. And as I mentioned, all of the drugs increase dopamine in the reward centers. So dopamine is stimulated, and that activates reward center, and this is perceived as pleasure. But with repeated drug use, these systems start to adapt to the massive increases of dopamine, producing neuroadaptations that actually lead to a downregulation of that dopaminergic pathway. So normally dopamine is liberated by drugs. It interacts with these molecules called receptors. And what we see is that with repeated drug in addicted people, these receptors start to decrease. So this is the brain of a normal person with a lot of receptors in the central parts of the brain where you have the reward centers, and this is the brain of a cocaine-addicted individual where you can clearly see the decreases in the numbers of dopamine D2 receptors. And it is telling that these reductions in dopamine D2 receptors are not unique to one type of addiction, cocaine. They are also observed in addiction to methamphetamine. They are also observed in addiction to alcohol. They are also observed in addiction to heroin. And they are also observed in addiction to nicotine. And in animal models, animals that actually have low levels of dopamine receptors are much more prone to administer drugs compulsively. And indeed, using experiments in rats, our group has been able to show in animal models where you actually train the animals to self-administer cocaine or alcohol at high quantities, that in these animals, if we do a gene therapy that will allow us to increase these receptors, which we can do in rats but not in humans, then we can profoundly inhibit the behavior of drug taking. And this is illustrated here. This is a study that we did many years ago in rats that were made addicted to alcohol. We injected them with a gene that encodes for the dopamine D2 receptor, and we injected it directly into the nucleus accumbens. This results in an increase in the levels, expression of this receptor at day 4, and as the days progress, it goes back to baseline. But we can inject again, which we do at day 20, and the receptors go up. And when we do that and we observe the behavior, we see a dramatic decrease, in this case, in alcohol taking. This is decreases in alcohol intake. At day 4, when you have the maximal increases, you see a dramatic reduction, 70% lower alcohol consumption. Similar findings are observed after cocaine in a similar animal model. As the receptors go back to baseline, drinking goes back to baseline. We inject again, drinking is reduced dramatically, which is actually extremely interesting because it tells us that one single molecule, a protein in our brain, is able to modulate the propensity for the consumption of high quantities of drugs. One single protein. Now, one of the questions is, why is this protein so important in regulating our intakes of drugs? Or when you are low in this receptor, you consume high quantities of drugs. By using imaging studies in which we actually measure the dopamine receptors in the same individuals, but we also measure their consumption of glucose. We can actually ask the question, when dopamine receptors are decreased, what areas of the brain are damaged? And what we've been able to observe systematically, whether it is in cocaine abusers, methamphetamine abusers, or alcoholics, the lower the levels of dopamine receptors, the lower the activity of the frontal cortex, indicating that this protein is modulating our propensity to compulsively consume high quantities of drugs by decreasing, when those proteins are not there signaling, then decreasing the activity of the frontal areas of the brain, which are actually indispensable for our ability to make judgments and to exert control over our desires. Now, we also, apart from the very specific studies on the effects of drugs on the brain that have led us to understand the landscape of changes in the brain of people of addiction, studies are ongoing also to try to understand the multiple factors that contribute to the vulnerability of an individual to become addicted. Because we know, yes, that repeated drug use affects the way that the brain works, which then results in addiction. But we also know that not every person that takes drugs will become addicted. And we know that genes play a very important role in determining who's vulnerable, and genes play a very important role in determining who is resilient, who will have a protection. We also discuss biology, developmental stage. The age at which you start taking drugs is also extremely important. The younger you start to drink alcohol, the younger you start to smoke marijuana, the younger you start to smoke cigarettes, the greater the probability that you will become addicted. And finally, we also know, and we've known this for many, many years, that the environment is crucial in determining, through vulnerability factors or protective factors, whether a person will become addicted or not. We know that family environments that are supportive provide resilience, protection. We know environments that are high in crime and neglect make the individual much more vulnerable to addiction. And what science has enabled us to do, finally, is to actually ask the question and answer it about why is it, what do environments do to our brain that make it either more vulnerable or protected. So now we can directly inquire, what is it? Why is it that the environment is so important? And why is it that the environment, particularly in childhood and adolescence, is so crucial in determining trajectories of substance use disorders as well as mental illness? And this study illustrates one of those research findings. This is a study done in non-human primates, monkeys. These are monkeys in which they are measuring the dopamine receptors, which I show you modulates propensity for administration of drugs. Low levels make you vulnerable, high levels protect you. These animals have been reared, lived all their life in isolation, one animal per cage, which is highly stressful for primates of all classes. When they were adults, the researchers measured their receptors, and you see them here in the basal ganglia, where the nucleus accumbens is located. Then they take these animals and they bring them into a group environment. They remove the isolation. Some of these animals become dominant, and some of these animals become subordinate. And when the hierarchical structure has formed, they actually measured those dopamine D2 receptors again. And what they found was fascinating. Those animals that went from isolation into becoming a dominant increased the level of dopamine receptors in the brain. In contrast, those animals that from isolation became subordinate did not change, and in some instances decreased the expression, the levels of dopamine receptors in the brain. And lo and behold, when the investigators took these animals into the laboratory to test their propensity for self-administering drugs, they find that the dominant animals with high levels of dopamine receptors did not administer cocaine, whereas the animals, subordinates with low levels of receptors, readily administer high doses of cocaine, identifying a mechanism by why social factors, social stressors, in this case very low levels in isolation, but also social factors that can be protective, becoming a dominant in a hierarchical structure, can actually modulate the levels of these receptors, which are making an individual more or less vulnerable for consumption of high quantities of drugs. And after this study, more recently, a study in California documented that in human subjects, indeed, the level of social support was associated with the expression, the levels of dopamine D2 receptors. That is, individuals with strong support systems had higher levels of dopamine D2 receptors as opposed to individuals that did not have those systems, which have low levels of dopamine receptors. Now, as you think at this data and you ask the question, well, how do I use this data? How can it be useful in the problem of substance use disorders? This data illustrates the notion that if we're going to be doing prevention, we need to be aware, particularly, of those individuals that are at higher risk because of environmentally stressful situations, to tailor interventions that can buffer the adverse effects of social stressors. And does prevention work? Is it worth our effort? And the answer is an unequivocal yes. And I'm going to show the unequivocal yes with data. This is data that we have been funded since 1976. Every year, we actually ask questions from close to 50,000 adolescents in the United States in the school system, vis-a-vis, on the one hand, their pattern of drug use, and on the other hand, their perception about the risks of drugs. And what you are observing in this graph is two points. One of them is the point of the reported past year of marijuana, which is in blue, and in the other one, the number of kids that perceive marijuana as risky. And what's interesting and very telling on this graph is as basically less number of adolescents perceive marijuana as risky, you have much higher rates of marijuana use in this population. In contrast, when there is a greater number of kids perceiving marijuana as risky, there is a much lower consumption of marijuana in these individuals, indicating that campaigns that educate adolescents in ways that are objective and important or salient to them can affect significantly their behavior vis-a-vis drug taking. Now, what do we know? And we funded years and years of prevention research, and there are many strategies. What we know about prevention is that you need a multi-pronged approach. And the multi-pronged approach should actually target strategies that go from the individual into the community. We know that prevention strategies that involve the family are one of the most important ones we can do. But we also know that prevention strategies that involve the educational system can also be very effective. And we know that those prevention strategies that actually combine these different levels are the most effective. We also know that the strategies are actually quite simple. You need to actually do interventions that will reduce risk factors, like at the individual level, early aggressive behavior, poor social skill, poor self-control. At the community level, availability of drugs. In terms of the protective factors, we want to actually increase this one, elevate self-control, promote parenting, positive parenting attitude, promote educational achievements. So you increase protective factors, you decrease risky factors. Now we also know, and this is the final point that I make about addiction, that addiction is a disease that can be treated, despite the stigma associated with it, and despite the perception by many that addiction cannot be treated. And I'm showing you here the brain of a person that was addicted to methamphetamine 1 month after last use of methamphetamine, and you can clearly see the difference from a normal control. This individual was successful in its rehabilitation program and was able to abstain for 14 months of treatment. When we scan him again, you see the recovery of brain function, and we see the success in that this individual was able to stop taking drugs during that time period. So treatment works. So then why is the perception that treatment does not work? Well, the perception that treatment does not work is that it is the magical thinking that drug addiction is a disease that you cure, like you cure an infection with an antibiotic. You have staphylococcal infection, I give you antibiotic, 3 weeks later you are cured. You have salmonella, I give you your antibiotic, 2 weeks later you are cured. That's not the case with addiction. Addiction is a chronic disease, and I started by saying the changes in the brain persist months, sometimes years after the use of the drug, which means you need to have continued treatment. And that is not unique for drug addiction. It's actually becoming increasingly common because some of the most challenging diseases that we face in the healthcare system, the most frequent diseases that we face in the healthcare system are chronic diseases. And we know chronic diseases you treat continuously. And yet we have failed to realize this, to incorporate it. And this is illustrated here. Hypertension. Any physician knows that if a person has hypertension, they need to take their antihypertensive medication for the blood pressure to go down. And this is illustrated here. High blood pressure takes the drug. If the person stops taking the drug, guess what? Simple, predictable. Blood pressure goes up. And this is used clearly, unequivocally, to say antihypertensives are very effective in controlling blood pressure. But in drug addiction, we use a completely different logic. You have a person that's addicted, you name it, alcohol, cocaine. They go to treatment, and their drinking goes down. And then they are released from treatment. There you are cured. You stop the treatment of a chronic disease. Predictable. The drinking goes up again. The patient relapses. But in our field, we're using the failure, this relapse, as an indication that treatment does not work. In contrast to the recognition that addiction is a chronic disease and needs to be handled as other diseases with a chronic model of care. I want to end my presentation also by saying that addiction, I show you some of the changes in the brain, involving what? Our frontal cortex that allows us to exert control of our desires. But it's also involving the dopamine system. It is dysfunctional. And these two systems, the dopamine system and the frontal system, are actually crucial for all of us. Basically, it does not matter whether we are addicted or not. We need these systems to make decisions on a day-by-day basis, multiple times a day, whether we are going to do something that we want to do or not, whether it is appropriate or not, whether we shouldn't do it, even though we want to do it. So we may be faced with something that is very, very desirable, and our pleasure centers want it, but our prefrontal cortex, our frontal cortex says, no, it's not appropriate. Then the frontal cortex can directly inhibit that drive to do it. You inhibit it and you stop. In an addicted person, the area of the brain that is able to stop is not functioning. And the desire for that particular drug is enhanced, what we call sensitized. So when you have this unbalance between the frontal cortex not performing properly and hypersensitive limbic system, the individual is left unable to stop the drive to take the drug. And this explains the repeated patterns of relapse and the compulsive intake of the drugs of people that are addicted, that they do at the expense of behaviors that are crucial for their survival. And with this, I want to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Volkov, for your impressive presentation. We have really the basic knowledge that we have to disseminate around the world, and we have to realize that based on these elements, we are really saying that addiction is a brain disease, should be treated appropriately and prevented appropriately. Thank you very much. I go very fast to the next speaker, We have the honor to have here Dr. Frans Trautmann. Dr. Frans Trautmann is from the Netherlands, but particularly from the Trimbos Institute. I can say, Dr. Trautmann, that Trimbos can be considered the European NIDA, because it's a really very impressive institute. It's an excellent center producing a lot of studies, and Dr. Frans Trautmann is the head in the Trimbos Institute of the International Affairs Unit. You have the floor, Dr. Trautmann.
Thank you very much, Dr. Guerra. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start with saying that I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me here. I would like to thank them especially for the warm welcome and the great hospitality. It is a pleasure for me to be here. It's also the first time that I'm in Saudi Arabia. I had some interesting talks already yesterday with some colleagues here. I would be very interested to also discuss in the next days further with colleagues from different regions here. Dr. Guerra, but also Dr. Volkov already paved the way for the presentation I make. I have been asked to present what we are doing in the Netherlands in the field of prevention and treatment and care. It's much for 20 minutes, but I will rush through. And again, I thank Dr. Volkov for the good fundament for the presentation, because certain things are much clearer now than would have been without her presentation. I shortly go through what is the Trimbos Institute. Dr. Guerra already gave a lot of compliments. Thank you for this. I would like to shortly give some key notions about our drug policy and then go to prevention and treatment. We are a private institute. In fact, in the Netherlands we have 220 staff, and we are focusing on applied knowledge of mental health and addiction and policy and practice, etc. So core task is the development and research and information and implementation. And we are seeing us as being a sort of linking pin between science and research, policy and practice. So we are doing a lot of things in the field of prevention. We are developing approaches. We are running a national program. We do a lot of things in the field of care, harm reduction. You can see this all there. I have been especially involved in the last year also in policy research. We just did a study on the European illicit drug market together with RAND and ICPR in London. And this is another favorite work area for me. If it comes to key notions of drug policy in our country, points of departure, and again, this has been said already before, the drug problem is in the first place a health problem. So this is also why we decided that our Ministry of Health is coordinating drug policy. The key aims of our policy is to prevent harm. So to individual users, of course, and this is following very much of the line also what Dr. Wolfgang just presented, but also their social surroundings and harm to, of course, society as a whole, and then you can think more about nuisance, about drug crime, etc. We have decided, and this is part of our national tradition, we are going for a pragmatic policy. Our policy is not principle-based. We are not striving to have a drug-free society because a drug-free society simply seems to us unrealistic, taking into account human history. We have 3 tools, the normal 3 tools, nothing different from other countries. Demand reduction, this is care and prevention. Supply reduction, the fight of supply, but also the control of supply, controlling regimes of supply. And of course, tackling organized crime. And what is especially important in our, let's say, urban areas, reduction of drug use-related nuisance and maintaining public order. Key notions again of demand reduction, and then I turn to prevention and treatment and care. We have learned from starting with a rather naive approach 30 years ago, let's say, that it is good to work with an evidence-based, proven effective approach. So we invested a lot in evaluation research, checking effectiveness of approaches. We have had a national program in the field of treatment which we called scoring results. So we invested a lot in developing approaches, evaluate approaches, etc. We go for an integrated approach. Again, the speakers before already mentioned this. We are focusing on licit and illicit drugs, so tobacco, alcohol included. We link our services, prevention and treatment, with general health and mental health promotion and care. and we involve all relevant stakeholders, so not just health professionals, but I will come to this later. We have chosen for a step care approach from light to intensive interventions. This is a proven effective and cost-effective approach. And we have chosen for an approach which is generally described as continuum of care. We always start with, let's say, the starting point of a continuum of care is health education, followed by prevention. And in fact, it's a continuum. It's not step by step, but it's really every step is already starting the next step. Early detection of problem use, problem behavior, brief interventions as first step to take, not very intensive intervention, but sometimes a general practitioner, a well-trained general practitioner, can be very helpful to solve problems. Treatment, and then care harm reduction for people who are not treated successfully, who are staying with problem use, and then, of course, reintegration. Health education. This is what is generally also now called universal prevention, drug education. We see it as part of health promotion, aiming on abstinence and preventing and reducing health damage. We have a national program at our institute, the Healthy School and Drugs, and the emphasis in this program is individual responsibility. You have to educate people that they can make their own choices, factual, objective, non-judgmental and up-to-date information, and focus, of course, on the target group's perception. It doesn't make sense to preach in a language which is not taken, which is not understood by the target group. For instance, our school health policy and our role as the institute is we are developing the materials, we are developing the approaches, we are training the trainers, which are the local municipal health services, and then the municipal health service do the local implementation in schools. We have not just prevention programs in the classroom. We organize always a coordinating committee in schools, which is taking care for the drug issue in schools, again, including tobacco and alcohol. We prepare this education program. We also develop school regulations, a sort of school policy. What do you do if drug use is popping up in school? If you find a pupil who's using drugs, or if you see that drug use is around the school, what do you do? Early detection and counseling, training teachers to see the symptoms and to deal with them properly. It's also the responsibility of school teachers to do something with this. And of course, parents' participation. Again, looking back to Nora Volkov's presentation, it's very clear you have to include all these stakeholders. Our school program then, we developed materials for pupils, but also for parents, for teachers, and for the regional or local health services. This is just an illustration. These are materials for students we have developed. In the field of drug prevention, we also chose for what we call an integrative approach, focusing on the different life areas. And it's a bit theoretical, but you have school, you have home, you have leisure time. So these are the three areas in which we are working. We are focusing on knowledge. Again, what I said before, full factual, non-judgmental information, attitude, social norms, life skills. And this non-judgmental is very important for me. We have seen programs in different countries where you had, let's say, fear-based programs. So heroin is death, this sort of campaigns. These campaigns we have seen from different evaluation programs, they don't work. Fear doesn't change behavior in this way. We have integrated our prevention programs in a broader framework, so it's more health promotion, but also again, then we come back to the presentation before, to life skills. How do young people cope with problems in their surroundings, with grief, with frustrations? These are the risk situations, so how do we train young people to deal successfully with this sort of situations? Also, we focus on lifestyle, youth culture. All these things have to be included. It's not just the message that drugs are dangerous and specify the dangers. You have to have a much broader package. We are involving various stakeholders. So of course it is schools, etc., parents, of course, but also besides the health, drugs and drug services, also club and pub owners we are including in our strategies, personnel from clubs and pubs, and sport, etc. And of course, the community, which is always said easily, it's quite difficult to include the community. What is the community? So you have to see that you get the important stakeholders in the community on board. We are focusing again, and this is part of the integrative approach, of course, on legal alcohol and tobacco, and sometimes also psychopharmaceuticals and illegal substances. Here just some illustrations of the material we have developed. We have chat, we have a website, we have a helpline, people can chat with professionals, and we have people especially who go to parties where they can get information about health risks involved, etc. All this material. We have also a sort of risk reduction online. We know, we would like that young people do not use drugs. We know that they are using drugs, they're experimenting, etc., etc. So we give some personal advice, and people, we have a sort of application that they can see what is risky, where do they do well, where they could profit, where they could learn a bit, and where really work has to be done, where they're really running into problems. And this website has about 5,000 visitors monthly. It depends a bit on also, let's say, the cultural programs in the country. We are focusing on the drinking environment, as we call, and this picture might make you think that these people are drinking alcohol. They are not drinking alcohol. We are focusing a lot on campaigns and with involvement of young people, and our Australian colleagues do the same at the moment, to focus on non-alcoholic drinks, that non-alcoholic drinks can also be fun. It's not just alcohol, which might be seen as fun, but also non-alcoholic drinks. We do quite some campaigns on this point in very different ways. Also, yesterday was Queen's Day in our country, and our institute was in different parties. We were running this Happy Drinks event, serving non-alcoholic drinks. We have training for bar staff, bar code it is called, meaning that we train bar staff to behave responsible, not to serve too many drinks to young people, etc., but also bar smart, dealing with alcohol and aggressive behavior. We have developed in the European project with colleagues from England, Belgium, etc., a healthy nightlife toolbox, how to make nightlife more healthy, less risky, to support professionals to do this, again also including people who run a discotheque, etc., etc. We have a center for safe and healthy nightlife. Again, these are simply, we give info sheets, we have an internet, we have a website, newsletter, etc. So this is to finish with prevention. We have a continuum approach also here. First step is supporting abstinence. The second is, let's say, reducing risks of experimental and recreational use, which is very common among young people, especially if you look into alcohol and tobacco. Specific indicated prevention for vulnerable groups, reducing and then harm of regular use, and of course, the early detection of regular problem use is the linking pin with treatment. Treatment and care, some key notions. Again, we base this on effectiveness studies. We moved, based on this, from long-term inpatient to outpatient treatment, and a combination of short-term inpatient and longer-term outpatient treatment. The reasons for this is a mix of effectiveness and also economic arguments. But effectiveness is, of course, if you isolate a drug user for 12 months in a therapeutic community and then set him free, he's simply coming back in the same surroundings where he left, and the risk of relapse is simply very high. So you have to train a person to survive in his normal living surroundings drug-free. And this means that you have to work really outpatient and, again, with the involvement of other stakeholders. Accessibility and differentiation of treatment options. There are very different ways of treatment, and each of them is effective in a different way. Some of them are also ineffective. We don't use them. Services adapted to the needs of the target group. So, for instance, we have outpatient programs in the evening for clients who have a job, who are working, who can't come during office hours. We have a multidisciplinary approach. We have cooperation between different addiction care centers, general health care sector, but also judicial authorities. And again, we have this step care approach from light to intensive interventions. Because sometimes if you have a problem user and you put him simply in a 12-month inpatient treatment, it is overkill. It is not needed. It's not required. It's not required for the person, but it's also extremely expensive for the system. Just to show you about the treatment demand in the Netherlands, And treatment demand, you see alcohol from 2002 to 2011, the green curve up. Opiate use is dramatically falling, and then we really talk about treatment demand. You see the yellow line coming up quite steep is cannabis. This is not just treatment demand, it also has to do with the fact from 2000 on we started to offer cannabis, problem cannabis use treatment. Before there was no treatment, so there was simply also no demand. But you see that cannabis use is really going up, and opiate use, you really can say, yes, this is falling. We have let's say the prevalence of opiate use, heroin use in the Netherlands is falling since many years. Opium, heroin is not seen as fancy anymore by young people. It is seen, if you interview young people, they see it as a loser's drug. Cannabis is more fancy, cocaine is more fancy, etc. But this is, we have started really to develop treatment programs beside alcohol, opiates, etc. And then you see that the demand for this treatment is rising. And the last word is gokken. This is gambling. It's a Dutch sheet, and I don't think that you speak Dutch. Individuals in treatment by primary problem. The blue one is alcohol, and this is also, again, also to show that it is simply important. If we talk about drug use, drug prevention, drug treatment, we have to include alcohol. And unfortunately, we don't mention tobacco here on this sheet, but tobacco is, of course, another huge problem. Continuum of care, point of departure is always this abstinence-oriented programs, the first option. We start there with outpatient treatment from brief to more intensive interventions. And these brief interventions, they are generally cognitive behavioral therapy, 6 sessions, 12 sessions. They prove to be very effective for people with a short drug-using career. Inpatient treatment, we have minimum 3 weeks and maximum 1 year, especially for double diagnosis. There we have, of course, much more intensive forms of treatment combined, of course, with other forms of psychiatric treatment. We have crisis and detox units. Sometimes we use this just as a start, and then it's followed up by outpatient treatment. We have also programs which are rather effective, programs to reduce levels of use. Especially for alcohol and cannabis, we are using this, and we more and more apply it for these e-health tools, so internet tools where people can use anonymously self-management applications to reduce their use. We have evaluated these programs, and they prove to be very effective. All these programs always include the option that if a person is interested in a talk with a psychotherapist or entering a program, they can click to a link and they are referred to a face-to-face contact. Of course, we have harm reduction programs for people who are, for whatever reason, not stopping their use. These are low-threshold methadone programs and other programs, substitution programs, outreach work, day and night shelters, drop-in centers, needle exchange, social assistance. Though needle exchange, we are stopping with this because we have had a massive change from injecting to smoking, so we hardly have any injectors anymore. And on the other hand, what I said before, heroin use is falling. And then we have, of course, social integration and rehabilitation, which is on the one hand education, social skills training. It's also aftercare for people who have been in treatment, and then, of course, also getting people to work again. And finally, in the step care, what I said before, we go from minimal, brief interventions to more intensive, long-term forms, and we start with early detection and basic counseling. Early detection is generally the task of general practitioners, but also in schools we are training teachers to be aware of the symptoms of possible drug use and to deal with them properly. We do a lot with empowerment and self-management. We have seen that self-management is very effective because you simply have people helping themselves, and especially, again, e-health is one of the things where we are working on a lot in the past years. Counseling and brief interventions, and then outpatient to inpatient, and in the end, social care and welfare institutions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Trautmann. It's a really impressive presentation. It's reflecting the commitment and the balance of the government of the Netherlands in preparing the service for this disease. And I think that the lesson from this lecture is that the government of the Netherlands has chosen to adopt strategies, policy based on science, based on evidence, and with a very well-balanced and comprehensive approach. This could be really a model to be exported. I am a little late with this section. We have 20 minutes late, and the organization is asking me to ask the speaker to maintain the time, but I will never stop a speaker. I will never stop a speaker of this value coming from so far, and I really think that is a benefit for this conference to give the speakers all the time they need to explain what they have to propose. In case, I think that we will have to reduce the time for our break, but it's important to have the opportunity to give them the maximum of space. So now I give the floor to Professor Margaret Hamilton from Australia, from Victoria. She was a founding director and Turning Point Alcohol and Drug Center in Victoria, and I know her very well. She's already there on the podium. I know her very well because she's coming as a most significant representative of Australia every year to the Commission on Narcotic Drugs in Vienna. So she's really representing Australia in her position. And she was also the former chair of the Multiple and Complex Needs Panel. And she was also a member of the Prime Minister Council of Homeless. No, she is a member of the Prime Minister of Council on Homeless and the chair of the Cancer Victoria Board. We worked also together about the issue of access to pain medication. Thank you for being here, and I give you the floor, Professor Hamilton. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gilberto, and thank you, everybody. Thank you for the honour and the opportunity to present in this forum. And I also wish to acknowledge the women who are in the parallel venue today. It's a privilege to be here in your country, again, also for me the first time. And I also want to acknowledge the leadership that you are showing in your efforts in relation to drugs. It's very impressive and it's very interesting to visit and see another culture and the ways in which they respond to drugs. I want to talk about our national drug strategy as a way of talking about integrated approaches when you're looking at prevention and treatment. Obviously, I'm from Australia and I bring my own perspective, and I recognise and acknowledge that not everything that we do will be relevant or appropriate for another country and another culture. But I want to talk today a bit about our national drug strategy, which has been in place since 1985, the importance of the use of data, the collection of it and its use together with other evidence, including evaluations of effectiveness and efficiency, that is, does it cost a lot to do treatment, or can we do treatment sometimes more efficiently? And some of the issues around complexity of actually the approaches that we use, which are not always rational or necessarily always grounded in evidence. And I might very, very briefly talk about some of the frameworks for treatment. Like this country, Australia has some very particular features that mean that we have some very particular drug problems. Firstly, we are an island, and this makes it a little easier in some ways for our interdiction efforts and some efforts on the part of border control. On the other hand, with increasing communication, transportation, including internet and postage and mail, it is increasingly difficult for us to isolate ourselves in that way. We also have a country that is mostly desert, so we have some similarities. We are a federation of a number of different states and territories, and that is very significant when it comes to achieving a national strategy. These states and territories cooperate, but also very often compete. So competition is rife within our own country. And we have a number of cultural histories, including our Indigenous, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, the early Western settlers, the many migrant groups which are contributing to the increase in multiculturalism. But all of our prevention and treatment efforts are grounded in and embedded in our national drug strategy. This strategy has been in place since about 1985, when we had the development of what was called the National Campaign Against Drug Abuse. I'm not going to go through the detail here, but I want you to note especially the pink colour and the evaluations, the importance of constantly evaluating what is happening with patterns of drug use, what is the response, and how effective is our current response. So since 1985 to our current strategy, which is determined for 2010 to 2015, we have been constantly evaluating and making changes as the world of drugs and drug users change. There are many partnerships associated with our national drug strategy. Our Prime Minister, who is our parliamentary leader, relies very much on the Ministerial Committee on the Drug Strategy, the Principal Committee. This includes people from law enforcement, regulation, and also from health, and to some extent also education. This brings together all the states, territories, and our federal ministers' representatives in the Intergovernmental Committee on Drugs. And I sit as a member of the organisation on the left, the Australian National Council on Drugs, which provides advice directly to the Prime Minister and also to the States and Territories Ministerial Committee. Just to acknowledge that I am a member of the Executive, along with others, and there are 12 additional members to these. The key features of our national drug strategy, and the reason that I am spending time on this, is that I think it is fundamental to how we approach prevention and treatment. Firstly, we have a very strong partnership at every level between law enforcement and health. Whether it is when I was running a treatment service and I required the police in our local area from time to time to come and assist me when we had trouble in the waiting room, or whether it is at our national policy level determining what do we do about the new analogue drugs. Should they be legal? Should they be illegal? What are the consequences of making these decisions? These partnerships are very important, and we are very close, and we speak to one another very frequently. As in the Netherlands, our national drug strategy covers all drugs, the legal ones and the illegal or illicit ones. It has been necessary always to have very strong leadership, and this is why our Prime Minister's attitude to the drug strategy has always been very critical. We are very committed to the use of evidence, and as I said, we review and evaluate and try and refocus and refresh our strategy from time to time. We also make extreme efforts to engage the broader community, awareness raising, participation, including efforts for families. And so, very similar to the Netherlands, our approach is a harm minimisation approach where we focus in our system on 3 pillars: reducing supply, reducing demand, and working to reduce harm. In terms of where does the budget go in these different areas, this gives you some quick look at this. Law enforcement, 42% of our drug budget, prevention, 23%, and treatment, 17%, and some others, including interdiction. The priorities for the current national drug strategy, I'm not going to go through all of these. For those of you who are able to read, you will see that there are a range. These including, at the top of the list, our alcohol concern, which I won't focus on, but I will talk particularly about smoking of tobacco, monitoring illegal drug use. I will talk extremely briefly, mention pharmaceutical drug use, but I think later in this meeting my colleague Dr. Dobbin will be presenting on this, and something about planning for treatment and data collection. So you might ask, how do we set our priorities? Well, in our review and evaluation, we try to have as much reliable data as possible available. We try to look at the evidence, that is evidence from research about what's effective, and we try to utilise this in our training programs for our workforce, but also work hard at implementation. We try to monitor whether we're succeeding or where do we need to improve. And we use consultation with a range of different groups and audiences. Our data source include national surveys of drug use, household surveys, mortality and morbidity statistics, road fatality data, drug-related convictions data from the legal system, the incidence of HIV and other blood-borne diseases,